Don't say her name again, Jungkook whispered into the dark rehearsal room, his knuckles white around the mic stand, because every time you do, something inside me breaks. The lights flickered as the bass from the studio next door thudded like a second heartbeat, and Jimin froze mid-step, rainwater dripping from his jacket onto the polished floor. He could smell ozone from the faulty wiring, could hear Jungkook's breathing too fast, too close to panic. This wasn't jealousy in the harmless sense. This was something heavier, obsessive, sharp enough to cut. Earlier that night, Jimin had laughed. He talked too freely, as he always did when he was tired and honest, about the actress whose films he loved, the way her eyes held sorrow without begging for pity, the way her silence spoke louder than dialogue. He'd spoken her name like a confession, never imagining it would lodge itself so deeply inside Jungkook. Now Jungkook's gaze wasn't angry, that scared Jimin more. It was focused, distant, as if he were staring at something only he could see. "You don't understand," Jungkook said softly. "When you talk about her, it's like you're somewhere I can't follow." Jimin took a step forward, then stopped. He had learned over years of friendship to read Jungkook's silences. This one trembled. Jungkook had always been intense, obsessive about perfection, about control, about protecting the fragile world he built with music. But lately something had shifted. Sleepless nights, sketches abandoned half-finished, a phone screen lighting up at odd hours always turned face down. Jungkook's obsession hadn't started with desire. It began with curiosity. He'd watched one of her films by accident late at night, volume low, exhaustion blurring the edges of his thoughts. Her character carried grief the way he carried melodies, quietly, relentlessly. He told himself it was admiration, artistic respect. But admiration turned into fixation, and fixation into something more dangerous when he realized she was the one Jimin loved from afar. What terrified Jungkook wasn't her. It was the idea of losing the one constant in his life. Jimin had been there before the fame calcified their days, before the world demanded pieces of them they couldn't afford to give. Loving the same unreachable figure twisted that fear into something irrational, something he hated himself for. "I never meant to hurt you," Jimin said, his voice low, steady despite the ache blooming in his chest. "She's just someone who makes me feel understood." Jungkook laughed once, bitter and short. "That's what I thought too." The confession slipped out before he could stop it. The nights he spent watching interviews on mute, memorizing expressions. The dreams where he stood on stage, singing not to crowds but to an empty seat he imagined she occupied. He spoke like someone peeling back skin, exposing something raw and ugly beneath. Jimin listened. He didn't interrupt. He saw not obsession but fear of abandonment, of being replaceable, of loving something that might pull them apart. Jungkook's hands trembled as he spoke, a habit he only had when he felt cornered by his own thoughts. "You're scared," Jimin said finally. Jungkook swallowed. The room smelled of dust and rain and old coffee. "Aren't you?" Silence stretched, thick but not hostile. Outside, thunder rolled, distant and tired. Jimin stepped closer this time and placed a hand over Jungkook's clenched fist, gently easing his grip on the mic stand. "I can admire her," he said, "and still choose us. You don't have to compete with a shadow." Something in Jungkook's eyes cracked. Not relief, release. He nodded once sharply, as if admitting defeat to himself. The obsession didn't vanish in that moment. It loosened, its grip no longer strangling but lingering like a bruise. Days passed, then weeks. Jungkook stopped watching interviews. He started writing again, melodies darker but honest. Jimin noticed the change in small ways, the way Jungkook slept between rehearsals, the way he laughed without forcing it. Healing wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, made of choices repeated daily. They never spoke her name again, not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer held power over them. On the night of their next performance, as the crowd roared and lights flooded the stage, Jungkook glanced sideways at Jimin. The fear was still there, somewhere deep, but it no longer ruled him. He sang not to an imagined figure in the dark, but to the living, breathing bond beside him, imperfect, resilient, real. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. The camera lights burned hotter than Jungkook remembered, a white heat that erased edges and left only truth behind, and when the director called for silence, he realized his pulse was loud enough to feel in his throat. He stood just off stage, fingers rubbing the faint scar at his wrist, a habit he never noticed until he was afraid. Across the studio, Jimin adjusted his in-ear monitors, smiling for the staff, moving with that familiar grace that made everything look lighter than it was. The audience couldn't see the tension coiled beneath the polished floor, the way memory pressed like a thumb against a bruise. The song began without warning, A low piano, a breath held too long. Jungkook stepped forward and sang. His voice carried the weight he hadn't known how to put down, each note shaped by nights of restraint and mornings of resolve. He didn't look for her face in the dark anymore, he looked for Jimin, he always did. It anchored him, kept the past from pulling him under. After the broadcast ended and the applause faded into polite echoes, the hallway smelled of hairspray and warm electronics. Jungkook leaned against the wall, eyes closed, letting the adrenaline drain. Jimin approached quietly as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile calm. "You were different tonight," Jimin said. Jungkook opened his eyes. "Better or worse?" "Honest," Jimin replied. That word lingered between them, heavy with implication. Honesty had cost them comfort before, it had also saved them. They left the building separately, a precaution born of habit rather than fear. Jungkook's car smelled faintly of leather and rain. The city slid past the windows, neon bleeding into puddles, and for the first time in weeks his phone stayed dark. No late-night spirals, no compulsive searches. He breathed through the quiet and let it be enough. But healing was not linear, it never was. The invitation arrived 2 days later, printed on thick ivory paper, the kind that announced importance without saying it aloud. A private industry screening, limited attendance, her name listed among the honored guests. Jungkook stared at it longer than necessary, the old reflex flaring like a phantom limb. His chest tightened, not with longing but with memory, the nights he had spent constructing a version of her that never existed, the way obsession had disguised itself as inspiration. He folded the invitation once, carefully, and placed it back in the envelope. When Jimin found it on the kitchen counter that evening, Jungkook didn't rush to explain. He watched Jimin read, watched the flicker of recognition and something like apprehension cross his face. "You don't have to go," Jimin said. "I know," Jungkook answered. The truth sat beneath that exchange, unspoken but acknowledged. Avoidance wasn't healing, neither was indulgence. Somewhere between the two was a narrow path Jungkook wasn't sure he could walk without slipping. That night, sleep came in fragments. Jungkook dreamed of stages without audiences, of spotlights illuminating empty chairs. He woke before dawn, heart racing, and padded barefoot into the living room. The city outside was quiet, a rare mercy. He picked up his guitar. The melody that emerged was restrained, almost austere. No soaring chorus, no dramatic climax, just a steady progression that refused to resolve, mirroring the way his thoughts circled without landing. He recorded it, named the file simply "Practice," and shut the laptop before overthinking could take root. In the days that followed, Jungkook worked harder than usual, filling his schedule with movement, dance rehearsals, vocal training, long runs that left his lungs burning and his mind blissfully empty. Jimin noticed, of course, he always did. "You're running from something," Jimin said one afternoon, stretching beside him on the studio floor. "Or toward it," Jungkook replied, staring at the ceiling. Jimin didn't press, he trusted Jungkook to arrive at his own conclusions even when the waiting hurt. The screening loomed anyway, a date circled by the industry whether Jungkook attended or not. He found himself thinking less about her presence and more about what it symbolized, the risk of relapse, the test of whether his growth was real or merely circumstantial. On the morning of the event, he stood in front of the mirror longer than necessary. Adjusting his jacket with mechanical precision, his reflection looked calm, he didn't feel it. Jimin watched from the doorway. "If you go," he said carefully, "go for yourself, not to prove anything." Jungkook nodded. "And if I do?" "Then that's proof too." The venue was understated, all dark wood and low lighting, designed to suggest intimacy rather than spectacle. Jungkook took his seat near the back, hands folded loosely in his lap. The smell of old books and fresh coffee mingled in the air. When she entered, there was no dramatic shift, no cinematic cue, just a subtle awareness like a change in pressure. Jungkook noted it, acknowledged the flicker of familiarity, and let it pass. She was smaller than his imagination had made her, more human. That, more than anything, dissolved the last of the illusion. The film played, it was good, it was moving. Jungkook appreciated it the way he appreciated craft now, without surrendering himself to it. When the lights came up, applause followed, sincere and warm. He left before the mingling began. Outside, the night air was cool and forgiving. Jungkook inhaled deeply, feeling something unclench inside his chest. He texted Jimin a single word. Home. They ate takeout on the couch, legs tangled, the television murmuring something neither of them watched. Jungkook spoke then, not in confession but in reflection, about how obsession had filled a void he hadn't known how to name. I thought if I held onto something perfect, he said, it would keep everything else from falling apart. Jimin rested his head against Jungkook's shoulder. Nothing real is perfect. I know, Jungkook replied, that's why I choose it anyway. Weeks passed. The song Jungkook had written found its way into their setlist, understated but resonant. Fans described it as mature, introspective. Jungkook smiled at that, understanding now that maturity wasn't the absence of intensity but the ability to carry it without letting it consume you. One evening after rehearsal, Jimin lingered in the doorway, watching Jungkook pack up. You okay? Jungkook asked. Jimin nodded. Yeah, I just realized something. What? That admiration doesn't have to turn into distance, not if you're honest about where you stand. Jungkook considered that, then smiled softly. We're learning. As they walked out into the cooling night, the city felt less like a maze and more like a map, still complex, still demanding but no longer designed to trap them. Jungkook felt the future open not as a grand promise, but as a series of choices he was finally ready to make, steady and deliberate, grounded in the quiet certainty that obsession had lost its hold, and what remained was something far stronger. Morning arrived without drama, the kind that crept in through thin curtains and softened the edges of everything it touched. Jungkook woke before the alarm not because of anxiety this time but because his mind had learned a new rhythm. He lay still, listening to the quiet mechanics of the apartment, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant hiss of traffic waking up somewhere far below, and felt an unfamiliar calm settle in his chest. He brewed coffee by memory, hands moving without thought. The smell grounded him. It reminded him of early rehearsals and late nights when exhaustion had been honest, not desperate. When Jimin emerged from the bedroom, hair still a mess, Jungkook watched him with a tenderness that surprised even himself. Not possession, not fear, just presence. They didn't talk much over breakfast. They didn't need to. Some understandings were earned through silence. The weeks that followed unfolded with a steadiness that felt earned rather than lucky. Jungkook began to notice how his body reacted to stress now, how his shoulders tightened before his thoughts spiraled, how his breath shortened when old patterns threatened to resurface. He learned to stop, to ground himself in small rituals, stretching before practice, writing one honest page before bed, leaving his phone in another room when sleep refused to come. Jimin noticed the changes too in the way Jungkook laughed more easily, in how he listened without retreating inward. Their conversations deepened, less guarded, more precise. They spoke about fear without dramatizing it, about admiration without shame. The woman who had once occupied too much space in their minds became what she always should have been, a talented stranger whose work had intersected briefly with their lives. One afternoon, during a break in rehearsal, Jungkook found himself alone in the practice room, the mirrors reflecting versions of himself he no longer felt trapped inside. He played the unfinished melody again, the one that had started as an act of avoidance and become something else entirely. This time he let it resolve. The chord landed softly, not triumphant, not tragic, just true. When Jimin returned, he listened without speaking, eyes closed, absorbing the quiet confidence in the music. It sounds like you, Jimin said when the last note faded. Jungkook exhaled, a slow release he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It finally is. The performance that followed weeks later was not announced as a turning point. No headlines marked it as such. But Jungkook felt it in the way he stepped onto the stage without scanning the crowd for ghosts, in the way he sang without proving anything to anyone. He felt it when Jimin met his eyes mid-song, grounding him with a look that said, here now, stay. Afterward, alone again in the dressing room, Jungkook caught his reflection and didn't flinch. He saw someone who had survived his own intensity, who had learned that obsession was not depth and restraint was not emptiness. Later that night, as they walked home under a sky dulled by city light, Jungkook spoke with the certainty of someone no longer negotiating with himself. I don't want to be ruled by what I admire, he said. I want to be shaped by what I choose. Jimin smiled, small and genuine. Then you're already there. The city moved around them, indifferent and alive. Jungkook felt the weight of the past loosen its final grip, not erased but integrated. He understood now that obsession had been a mirror reflecting his own unmet fears back at him. Facing them hadn't made him smaller, it had made him precise. They reached the apartment and closed the door behind them, the outside world muted once more. Inside, there was no perfection, no fantasy, just shared space, shared breath, and the quiet strength of having confronted something dark and walked through it together. And in that grounded stillness, Jungkook knew this was the resolution he had been searching for all along. Night settled gently over the apartment, not as a curtain falling but as a slow exhale. Jungkook moved through the familiar rooms with an awareness he hadn't possessed before, noticing how the floorboards creaked in specific places, how the lamp near the couch flickered for half a second before fully warming the space. These small details anchored him. They were proof of continuity, of a life that existed beyond obsession and projection. Jimin changed into something comfortable and sat cross-legged on the floor, stretching muscles still warm from rehearsal. Jungkook watched him for a moment longer than necessary, not because he was afraid of losing him anymore, but because he finally understood how much he had almost lost without realizing it. There had been a time when Jungkook believed intensity was proof of love, that if something didn't consume him, it wasn't worth holding onto. The realization that this belief had nearly fractured the most important bond in his life still sat heavy in his chest, not with guilt, but with responsibility. I was thinking, Jungkook said quietly, breaking the calm, about how close I came to confusing inspiration with escape. Jimin didn't look up. You're not the only one who's done that. But I was ready to disappear into it, Jungkook continued. Into something that didn't require me to be fully present. I think that scared me more than anything. Jimin finally met his gaze. You stayed. The simplicity of the statement hit harder than any confrontation ever could. Jungkook nodded once, throat tight. Staying had been the hardest choice. Staying meant feeling everything without anesthetic. Staying meant accountability. Later, when the apartment had gone quiet, and the city outside softened into a low, distant hum, Jungkook lay awake longer than usual, not restless but reflective. His thoughts drifted back to the version of himself who had stared too long at screens in the dark, mistaking proximity for connection, fantasy for understanding. He didn't hate that version of himself. He felt compassion for him. That boy had been trying to survive with the tools he had. Sleep eventually came, deep and unbroken. The next morning brought rain, fine and persistent, blurring the city into watercolor smears. Jungkook ran anyway, letting the cold soak through his clothes, each breath burning his lungs clean. Movement had become a form of honesty for him, his body telling truths his mind once avoided. When he returned, Jimin was at the kitchen table, scrolling through notes for choreography, tapping his pen absently against the wood. They shared a look, a quiet acknowledgement of routine regained. Days turned into schedules and schedules into momentum. Interviews came and went. Questions were asked that circled dangerously close to old narratives, about muses, about inspiration, about longing, but Jungkook answered with care now, redirecting without deflecting, choosing language that reflected growth rather than mystery. He no longer needed to be misunderstood to feel profound. One evening, alone in the studio, Jungkook listened to the final mix of the song that had marked his turning point. It wasn't the loudest track on the album. It wouldn't dominate charts, but it carried something rarer, restraint shaped by experience. He closed his eyes and let it wash over him, not as confession but as closure. He sent the file to Jimin without explanation. The reply came minutes later. This one feels like peace. Jungkook smiled. There were no grand gestures to signal the end of the chapter, no dramatic confrontations or symbolic farewells, just the quiet accumulation of better choices made repeatedly until they became instinct. On a night much like the first, Jungkook stood again in a rehearsal room, lights low, microphone waiting. This time when he gripped the stand, his hands were steady. The fear that once lived there had been replaced by something firmer, trust, earned slowly, painfully, and honestly. He sang not to fill a void but to express a fullness he had learned to protect. And when the last note faded into silence, Jungkook understood something with absolute clarity. Obsession had once promised him depth, but it was connection, real, imperfect, chosen, that had finally taught him how to breathe. Time no longer rushed him, it unfolded. Jungkook began to sense the difference in how days settled into his body, less like pressure, more like weight he could carry. Fame still demanded its rituals, its smiles and explanations, but it no longer dictated his inner weather. He had learned that discipline was not denial, it was direction. On a quiet afternoon, he returned to the old practice room alone, the one where tension had once cracked the air between him and Jimin. The mirrors were the same, the scuffed floor unchanged, but the room felt larger now, as if something invisible had been removed. He stood where he had once clenched the mic stand and let memory pass through him without resistance. It no longer hurt, it instructed. He sang softly, not rehearsing but remembering how fear had disguised itself as intensity, how admiration had curdled when mixed with insecurity. He didn't blame himself. He understood now that obsession had been a language he learned before he knew healthier ones. When Jimin joined him later, he didn't announce his presence. He simply leaned against the wall and listened. Jungkook noticed him only when the song ended, when the silence felt complete rather than awkward. "You sound lighter," Jimin said. Jungkook nodded. "I stopped trying to outrun myself." They sat on the floor, backs against the mirror, reflections fractured into overlapping angles. Jimin spoke about his own journey, how admiration could sometimes feel like a safe distance, a place to project longing without risk. How easy it was to love something unreachable because it couldn't ask anything back. "I think I was afraid too," Jimin admitted. "Not of you, of needing too much." Jungkook turned toward him, expression open. "Needing isn't weakness." "No," Jimin agreed, "but avoiding it is." That understanding settled between them, quiet and mutual. There was no apology demanded, no absolution granted, only recognition. As months passed, the story others told about Jungkook shifted. Critics wrote about restraint. Fans noticed a steadier presence, a warmth that didn't burn out as quickly. Jungkook noticed it most in himself, how his creativity no longer felt like an emergency, how inspiration arrived without obsession knocking it down. He saw her name occasionally, still circulating, still admired. It stirred nothing sharp, just respect, distant and clean. He wished her well in the abstract way one wishes well to strangers whose work once mattered deeply. Then he moved on. One evening, after a long day that left both of them quiet and pleasantly exhausted, Jungkook and Jimin sat by the window, city lights flickering below. Jungkook rested his head back against the glass, cool against his skin. "I used to think intensity was proof I was alive," Jungkook said, "but peace feels more real." Jimin smiled, leaning closer. "Peace doesn't need to shout." They stayed there until the city dimmed and the night grew thin. No music playing, no phones buzzing, just the sound of breathing synchronized without effort. Jungkook understood then that growth hadn't erased his capacity for depth, it had refined it. He could still feel fiercely, love deeply, create with hunger. But now those forces answered to him instead of ruling him. When sleep finally claimed them, it did so gently. And in that quiet surrender, Jungkook knew this chapter had ended not with a dramatic release but with something far rarer: balance. The season changed almost without notice. The air grew cooler, mornings sharper, and Jungkook found himself waking with a clarity that once felt impossible. There was no single moment he could point to and call transformation. It was accumulation, small decisions stacking quietly until they formed something solid. He began journaling again, not lyrics, not melodies, just sentences that didn't need to be beautiful. He wrote about envy without dressing it up, about fear without giving it mythology. He wrote about Jimin not as an anchor or a savior but as a constant presence who chose to stay and expected the same honesty in return. The pages smelled faintly of ink and coffee, and when he closed the notebook he felt lighter, as if he had set something down rather than locked it away. Jimin noticed the change most in how Jungkook listened. There was a patience now, a willingness to sit with uncertainty instead of rushing to resolve it. During rehearsals, Jungkook no longer pushed past exhaustion to prove endurance. He stopped when his body asked him to. The discipline remained, but the punishment was gone. One evening, after a long practice session, they walked through a quiet street lined with trees shedding the last of their leaves. The ground was damp, the smell of earth sharp and clean. Jungkook slowed his pace without thinking, matching Jimin's stride. "I used to be afraid that if I let go," Jungkook said, voice low, "everything I was would disappear." Jimin glanced at him. "And now?" "And now I know I was confusing control with identity." They stopped at a crosswalk, red light glowing softly between them and the empty road. For a moment, the city seemed to hold its breath. When the light changed, they crossed together. Work continued, music was released, applause followed. Jungkook received praise for depth, for vulnerability, for evolution. He accepted it with gratitude, not hunger. He no longer needed external reflection to confirm his worth. That had been the quietest victory of all. There were still difficult days, moments when insecurity whispered old lies, when admiration threatened to tilt into comparison. But now Jungkook recognized the pattern early. He didn't fight it. He acknowledged it, named it, and let it pass. The feeling lost its power once it was seen clearly. One night long after midnight, Jungkook sat alone at the piano, fingers resting on the keys without pressing down. The room was dark except for the city light slipping through the blinds. He thought of the boy he had been, intense, driven, afraid of being ordinary, terrified of being left behind. He didn't reject him. He honored him for surviving. The melody that emerged was simple, honest, it did ache, it breathed. When Jimin entered quietly and listened from the doorway, Jungkook didn't stop playing. He let the sound exist between them without explanation. When the final note faded, Jimin spoke softly. "This feels like an ending." Jungkook considered that, then shook his head gently. "It feels like continuity." They sat together, side by side, the silence comfortable, earned. There was no obsession filling the space now, no imagined audience, no unreachable figure casting a shadow. Just two people who had learned, separately and together, how to stay present without fear. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent and alive. Inside, Jungkook felt something settle into place, not closure in the dramatic sense but resolution in the truest one. The kind that didn't demand forgetting, only understanding. And in that understanding, Jungkook knew he was no longer ruled by what he admired or feared. He was guided by what he chose to protect. Winter arrived quietly without announcement, stitching itself into the city through pale mornings and longer nights. Jungkook welcomed it. Cold had a way of sharpening things, of stripping moments down to what was essential. He liked how his breath turned visible, proof that he was here, present, not lost in some internal echo. He spent more time alone, not in isolation but in intention. Solitude no longer felt like a vacuum he had to fill with noise or fixation. It became a place of calibration. He read books he had once abandoned halfway through, cooked meals that took longer than necessary, learned the patience of letting things simmer instead of forcing them to be done. Jimin noticed the difference in how Jungkook occupied space. He was less restless, more grounded, as if his feet finally trusted the floor beneath them. Their conversations shifted again, deeper not because they were heavier but because they were cleaner. They spoke about futures without urgency, about possibilities without fear of losing the present. One evening, after snow dusted the streets in uneven patterns, Jungkook received a message from a number he didn't recognize. It was brief, polite, professional, an invitation to collaborate. Her team. His pulse reacted before his mind did, a brief spike of old muscle memory, but it passed quickly like a reflex he no longer obeyed. He didn't answer immediately. He sat with it, letting the implications settle. This was the true test, he realized, not distance, not absence, but proximity without fantasy. Choice without drama. When he told Jimin, there was no tension in his voice, no hesitation. "I think I'll say no," Jungkook said. Jimin looked up from where he was tying his shoes. "Because of me." "No," Jungkook replied honestly, "because I don't want to confuse respect with attachment again." Jimin studied him for a moment, then nodded. "That sounds like you." Jungkook sent a polite decline, wished them well, and closed his phone. The relief that followed was quiet but profound, not because he had resisted temptation but because there had been no temptation to resist, only clarity. Music continued to evolve. Jungkook's work carried a different texture now, less sharp-edged, more dimensional. Critics called it restraint, fans called it growth, Jungkook called it truth. He understood that art didn't need to bleed to be real, sometimes it simply needed to breathe. On a night near the end of the year, Jungkook and Jimin stood on a rooftop overlooking the city, lights scattered like constellations below. The wind cut through their coats, cold and bracing. Jungkook leaned against the railing, hands tucked into his pockets. "I don't regret what happened," Jungkook said suddenly. Jimin turned toward him, "Even the hard parts." "Especially those," Jungkook answered. "They showed me where I was empty and where I was." Jimin smiled, the kind that carried understanding rather than reassurance. "You faced it." Jungkook nodded, facing it had been the point, not conquering, not erasing, just seeing clearly. As the year turned, there was no dramatic celebration, no symbolic marker of change, just the steady continuation of a life reclaimed from its own excess. Jungkook felt grateful, not in the grand sense but in the quiet, daily way that made gratitude durable. He knew now that obsession had once been his attempt to hold the world still, to freeze something beautiful so it couldn't leave him. Letting go hadn't made the world colder, it had made it larger. And standing there beside Jimin, breath clouding the air, city alive beneath them, Jungkook understood that the most powerful thing he had learned was not how to desire less, but how to choose better.